Karibuni sana, friends, brothers and sisters. If there are any skeptics, anyone who's also questioning the Christian faith, karibuni. This space is precisely for that function, for all of us to have a space where we can explore the questions of the faith that we have. And so this is precisely where you need to be at, and we are grateful that you have made the time. My name is Kevin Muriithi, and I'm the chairperson of Apologetic Kenya, which is a ministry that seeks to equip believers and engage skeptics, especially with regards to the questions that people are asking in this time, especially Africans, whether they be Christians or affiliated to a particular religion, or those who view themselves as skeptics or agnostics or atheists. In our time, we have people who ask questions. For example, one of the very important questions that many of us have come across includes a question like this one. As some people have said, when the Mzungu came, they came holding Bible. They asked us to pray. When we opened our eyes, they had the land, and we were left with what? With the Bible. So seemingly people seem to make the argument that Christianity is a white man's religion. It has been used to oppress Africans. And we had a very interesting conversation in the first part of this series, which was there last month, where Dr. Kyama Mugambi here helped us to consider the early African root of our Christian faith, how African people and African cities have played such a critical function in the spread of the gospel, in the spread of Christianity in the early centuries. And so today we are getting into the second bit. We are looking at the medieval period, which is seen as 500 to 1500 thereabouts. And we want to look at what happened to this Christianity, how did it develop in the same speed, so to speak, as it had in the early church period, that is 0 to 500 AD, and if it went through a sort of slow growth. What was the issue? People have also talked about Islam. Is Islam the reason that Christianity maybe did not go in particular areas in Africa? What was the main agenda for the Muslim mission when it began? These are some questions that arise when you consider this period of 500 to 1500. And with me today is Dr. Kyama Mugambi, a good friend of mine, who is a pastor or has served in the pastoral staff of Mavuno Church for many years. As well, he's the director of the Africa Theological Network Press that seeks to publish academic and theological books from the African context. He'll be telling us a little bit more about himself. So karibu sana, Dr. Kyama. Maybe you can just share briefly what you do for those who are joining us perhaps for the first time, and then we will kick off our conversation today. Karibu sana, Dr.
Thank you. As you heard, I'm Kyama. Kyama Mugambi, been a pastor for some years, also an academic, and very keen to learn about the church, and basically to help others understand what our faith is about, and what is happening, or what God is doing on the continent. I wear several hats. I'm a pastor at large with Mavuno Church. I teach at Park University and one or two other places, but I'm also involved in academic theological publishing with the Africa Theological Network Press, where our goal is to publish African theological materials for use in developing our leaders, whether it be at the seminary or wherever else that they'll be learning. So that's who I am. I'm married. I have 3 children, and we live in Nairobi. I know that there are people here from different parts of Africa. I live in Nairobi, Kenya.
Great. Clearly, I think we are in good hands. And so, last week we began, as I said, with the critical, early African period, and today we are looking at, 500 to 1500. Dr. Kyama, one of the things we said is that there was a strong presence of African Christianity, African theological reflection by important theologians in the global church, including gentlemen such as Augustine and Athanasius, but also critical figures such as Felicity and Perpetua, celebrated women martyrs in the early church, African descent. And maybe just a quick recap is, why was the growth high, or why was there this activity within the early, church period within the African continent?
Yeah. So one of the important things to note is that Christianity is by design meant to reach every part of the world. And Jesus himself said it, for God so loved the world, and his view was always a global outlook. Paul in Acts chapter 17 kind of affirms that, and by what he says, but also by his preaching to different places, Ephesus, Galatia, the Romans, and so on. And these are diverse places. Rome and Galatia. It's one side of Europe and the other side of Europe, and so on. So Christianity is by design, meant to reach out, and when it goes out, it goes into those places, and Christ incarnates into those places, and that's the whole point of Acts chapter 17, where Paul actually puts in a very summary statement, saying that's the whole point is that God created and pushed people to different places so that people would seek him out and find him. Africa is one of those places. And again, Africa is not the same. So you have Christianity all on the ridge, right next to the Mediterranean or Northern Africa, geographically close, very easy to get there from Antioch, very easy to get there from Jerusalem, very easy to get there from Rome. And so you have Coptic Christianity with influence from Greece in Alexandria in Egypt. You have Christianity, local Christianity, again, with people, a lot of interaction between Jerusalem, Antioch, which is a port city, and Cyrene, which is in Libya. And you see, Libya and Egypt are not the same. They don't speak the same languages. They're not the same people. It's not the same geography. And then further west, you have places like Carthage and Hippo, where Augustine comes from. And again, even there, Christ is present and is being preached. And so it grows. Several things happen. There is a very strong what was called a catechetical school, which is something like a cross between a Bible school and a catechism / apologetics space in Alexandria, which came from a literary tradition from before, one stream from the Greeks, another stream from the Arabs. And then on the other side, you have in Carthage, modern day Tunisia, right next to Algeria, you have another stream of theological thought with a lot of connections with Europe. So it grows from those, but also grows indigenously. And so in places like in Egypt, not just Alexandria, in Egypt, Christianity grows around the banks of the Nile and in the desert, and people are speaking the local language, which at the time was Copt. And so they're speaking that language over there, so Christianity is growing there.
Great. And I think that when we think about, this medieval period, if you may, I think the big year is 700 AD, the rise of Islam. But is there any, I think we kind of, in our history, when we looked at the history in the last session, we considered, about, 4th century, Augustine, I think, was the last figure we looked at. But is there anything significant, any other key figures? I know there's a rise of the, monasticism, but anything else up to 700 before we delve into that, the rise of Islam, anything worth knowing, mentioning?
Well, a number of things are going on at that time that are worth mentioning. I'll mention probably two. One is that through that period, zero to let me say 600, 700, there's a lot of shifting around of Christianity, because what's happening is that Christianity is now becoming institutionalized, from 313 after the Edict of Milan, when Christianity was brought on the same level as all the other religions. It institutionalizes, and so there's a lot of sort of shifting around. There's a major thing that happens in around 400, 420 there, where the Bishop of Rome, who we now call the Pope, began to sort of position the church in Rome as one of the major places. And so there were five big cities. There was Constantinople, there was Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome. In fact, they are called the Penta cities, the Pentapolis, or however one would want to call them. And so that's a major thing that happens. And Jerusalem becomes less important. Antioch becomes more important. Rome becomes more important. Those are far-flung areas. They're somewhere else. Alexandria gains prominence initially and then recedes. And so that's one major thing that is important to note. A second thing that is important to note is that by 700, persecution of Christians as we know it at the beginning, the kind of perpetua felicitas kind of persecution, Polycarp, kind of persecution. That kind of persecution it has finished, or let me say, is much less. There are other things now that are going on at this time. Basically, is controversies about how we believe and how we express ourselves as Christians. So I think those are the key things that I would want to say. Is Christianity at an all-time high? In Africa, Christianity is very strong, around 500, 600, because in 600, around 500, 600, Alexandria is sending bishops to Ethiopia and to Sudan. And the church in Egypt is actually supporting the church in what we call Sudan or Nubia today. Yeah.
Great. So 500, 600, that's the sort of activity. So the big thing, I think, in the history of, in the history of the African continent, I think, which is big, Islam now, among, the world, the largest, world religions as we currently speak. So 700, what is it that, necessitates the rise of Islam? What are its key tenets? What's the mission? Is it purely a religious movement? Is it a cultural movement? What is it?
Yeah, so Islam begins, 613. That's when Islam begins, and begins a very strong spread, into the 630s, into the 640s, and it spreads. Now, whenever we think of Islam, you're going to need to think of it a little differently than what is portrayed today in the amongst radical Muslims. Islam is largely spread by Arabs, and Arabs are a trading people. They live in the desert. They are traders. And they sort of specialize in this long distance, go get out there kind of trade. Go find whatever we can find and then bring it back. And so that's the Islam rides on that culture of trade. Go meet new people. Go interact, and it's also a literary culture. That's an interesting thing. It's a Middle Eastern culture. It is literary. It's also important for us to recognize that it is a Semitic culture and language. What does that mean? It means that it is a language that is tied to or a language that is in the same family as Hebrew itself. And so some of the words, like seven, seven in Arabic, seven in Hebrew, seven in Aramaic, seven in Ethiopian languages, the same word, for example, because they're Semitic. So that is what you know, that is where that comes from. And essentially, you have the Arabs traveling, and they travel all the way, coming to Africa, and they travel and they move westwards, or what they call the Maghreb, or in Swahili, or, you know, what we usually will say Magharibi. And that's where they're going, and they're going primarily for trade. And as they go out there, they have an instruction to subdue the peoples they find. Now, again, it's important for us to understand that it is not to the best interests of the Arabs to Islamize these people if they have any imperial interests, because Islam itself prevents, you know, the slavery of their own kind. And again, that's not very different from Hebrew. Again, in the Old Testament, you could not enslave your own person, and if you did, you had to release them every 7 years, and so on. So that's what's happening in 700, and you have around 700, 647 into 700, you have wave, which goes with the caliphate of the time. Caliphs are sort of like kings slash religious leaders who could trace their descent from Muhammad himself. And so the caliphate sort of instructed a movement westwards to go and subdue and conduct trade. And the particular caliphate that is responsible for that is called the Umayyad Caliphate. And those are the people now who move out in that initial first wave. And that first wave was, again, had 3 waves in it, you know, 647, I think 660 something, and towards the end, 690 something. And so it's basically, you know, go out there, the Caliph says, you know, go out there, you know, get what you can find, get the people that you can find, and you know, spread your culture and religion and learning as well, because Islam also is about learning, very, very strong on learning, their literary culture, their teaching and writing different things.
And I think certainly there's some truth, even when you look, I think, at contemporary Islam, I think that's big, you know. I mean, people keep on raising the whole issue of, you know, madrasa and how that, you know, makes Christianity run on its heels when we consider that's how serious they take the, you know, education. But would you say, and I think also there's definitely, of course, there are then threads of business and commerce and trade, and that's big also here. For example, even in Kenya, among our Muslim community. Maybe to just reflect again, I know I'm taking us forward to our current contemporary time. Is that still, how do you explain the religious extremism among groups of Islam? Some argue, we had you know, Jared Oginga also is a friend of ours. He's done a few sessions with us on the whole, on the you know, on the doctrinal side of the differences between Christianity and Islam. And some have argued that, you know, within Islam there's a sort of violence, a seed of violence. Do you think, or do you see that?
Yeah, that's a good one. Now, this might burst many people's bubble, but yes, Islam was, you know, has an element of conquest to it, but much of Islam's history is not violent. In fact, most of Islam's history is not violent. I regret to say that Christianity's history is way more violent than Islam's history, because the movement of the religion tracked culture and it tracked trade. That's what it was doing. So the violent streams of it are extremist, and they exist for relatively short times in history. And this is a history we're talking about. We're talking about 1300 years here. And so, you know, there are little pockets of you know, fundamentalist radical violence, and but Islam spread and took root way more in the peaceful times, and there's a very strong pacifist root in Islam, and there are two ways. The word Islam or Muslim, Islam is it means submission. In fact, in Swahili we have a word when you say I have submitted, you say nimesalimika. I have submitted myself, and so there are two sides of that, of submission. One side of submission is to submit and sort of acquiesce. I think that is the term that one would use. Another one, to submit, would be to make you submit. For much of Islam's history, it has been, sort of a pacifist kind of perspective, and so that's granted. That is not a very how do I put it? It's not a something that is very much talked about, but nevertheless, it is a reality. Now, one could point to the Middle East and say, well, but we can see in the Middle East, look, look what's happening in Palestine. They are violent people. They're always shooting rockets on this side. But that's a way more complex and very recent history. This is a history that starts from 1948, coming this way, and there are aspects of that history that are not told fully. So that if you talk to Palestinian Christians, for example, one would be able to get a much better picture. So yes, there is violence in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine and in parts of Syria and so on. But that is the product of a different history, and that's very recent. Even what we're talking about Al Qaeda, that is in our lifetime. That wasn't there, growing up. Yeah. So if you want to understand what Islam looks like for much of history, the best place to look is to look at the Emirates. The Emirates today, small countries, hardly have any armies. Those countries survive by trade. That's all they do, and there isn't very much there. But they have a long, thousands of years of a heritage of trade, and that's probably what more of Islam would in history.
Very interesting take. I think one that I guess stretches our thinking about it, even as we consider how to relate, I guess, with our Muslim neighbors and even colleagues, for those of us who live near them and work with them, and what that means, I think, for our Christian witness. So I think back to you mentioned 3 waves, and I think,
yeah,
if we can think of the waves, we can think about maybe 700 to 900.
Yeah.
Then we can think about 1100 to 1300 thereabouts, and 1400 to 1600.
Yeah.
Any key things to know about these 3 waves?
Yeah. So it's important. So we have that first wave that is the 7th century, from 647 onwards to just after after 700. That wave comes from Arabia. It's a shift from Arabia, and what happens over that time? You have trade and people moving right across the Maghreb. What at the time was called Mauritania. The Christians and the people in North Africa, and those people call that side, Mauritania. Greater Mauritania, and then just a place just west of Algeria would have been like Mauritania itself. But we have people moving from the East, Egypt, keeping on going, interacting with the Berbers, going further westwards. A few people actually go southwards into Mali, what you'd today call Mali, and into Niger, and some would argue even all the way up to Ghana. And so that's the first wave. The second wave happens a little later, and what's happening now in that wave is of a much more, let me say, a less mild movement of Berbers that are coming from. Berbers are the groups of people who are in that area, in Northern Africa. And again, the Berbers, we tend to call them the same thing, all of them, but they're not really the same thing. They look very different. There are some who are light-skinned, there's some who are dark-skinned, and so on. And so, it's a diverse group of people with, I suppose, different languages and differently nuanced cultures. But I'm going to take that from from the 1040s, moving on. We actually have a wave of people who come from the west and move back eastwards and southwards. And that is the second wave that is kind of like moving what one would call opposite what we had before. And so those would be they're known as the Almoravids, and they the Almoravids, again, it's a dynasty. It's maybe less, I don't know if one would call it a caliphate, but basically it's a family of power that reigned for 100 and something years, and they move backwards this way. And what they're trying to do, they're doing trade as well. They're a bit more strong in terms of the seeking conquest. And so they are reaching out towards the other peoples, and also coming down south. A third wave happens after that, and I'm going to pick that up from, say, 1300, the 1300s, and into like the 1500s, 1600s. And that is a big wave, again, which has got like a conquest approach to it, which is from Turkey. And this is the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire started out around 1299, all the way up to 1922, before right at the beginning of modern day Turkey. And this is a Muslim, it's a Muslim empire. It is very aggressive, and at its height, towards the end of 1600s into the 1700s, at its height, it controls everything, Southern Europe, all the way up to Italy, on this other side, all the way up to the Middle East, Palestine, coming downwards, all the way Iraq, have somehow some influence from that, coming down to North Africa, Egypt, Libya, so on. This empire has influence over all of that, and again, it's a trade empire. It is very economic in terms of its approach, and so that's kind of like the third wave in the 1300s, and 1300s all the way into the 1600s. Let me say something about what's going on around that second wave. In that second wave, some major things are going on in Europe, while some major things are going on in Africa. Around the time of the Almoravids, 1040 to 1147, missions are developing, monastic missions are developing. We have, several orders about to start. What are called the Dominicans, and people who what I call the mendicant orders. And so these are people who are going out to minister to people, even to Muslims. In fact, one of the things that they're trying to do is to go and reach out to Muslims. But we are also having about that time, we're also having the Crusades, happening to try and the Middle East, Jerusalem, for Christian pilgrimages. So that's happening at the same time, while the Almoravids are trying to consolidate their power in Africa. So I think it's important to note that everything is not static when things are going on in Africa. There are other things that are going on in some of these other places as well. And so, for example, one example is what's going on in terms of that kind of mission initiative. But something else that's also happening in Europe at that time. Europe is forming itself. In fact, from 800 onwards, Europe is sort of forming itself. That around that time, there's a lot of theology that's going on. That's Anselm or Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Comes in at around that time in terms of as a scholar, as a theologian. A little bit later, into we have Saint Thomas Aquinas, and again, these are important thought leaders of the time, and are very, very key in shaping Western European Christianity. So that's going on at that time as well. When the Ottoman Empire is happening, in the 1400s and the 1500s into the 1600s. This is in south of Europe. In mainland Europe, in the 1500s, in the 1400s into the 1500s, the Catholic Church, is having its challenges. There are problems with morality. There are problems with theology, problems with doctrine, and so on. The Reformation is beginning to ferment, so that in 1517, we have Martin Luther nail the thesis. He's not the only one. There are other people, afterwards Calvin. Before that, there were others, St. Catherine of Siena and others. Who are asking themselves, is this it? Is this what Christianity is about? And so that is going on in Europe at that time. Further south in Central Africa, in the 1400s, while the Portuguese and are trying to find a way to India, they bring Christianity, and that's the time, in Congo, for example, in the 1400s, we have a king who converts, Bemba Nzinga, and takes on the name Afonso, and he begins to see Christ and see Christianity as solution, as a way for him, way forward for him. It's small wonder that Congo is probably the most Catholic country in the world, probably outside of some of the other places in Latin America, for example.
Fantastic. My Excellency, I was just showing you how I am taking in the information. Fantastic history, and I think at least many of us would be well versed in the history, especially that's happening in Europe, because a majority of us would call ourselves maybe Protestants. At least that's the heritage we have. Yeah. And we know that is happening there. Besides Luther and Calvin, there are those proto-reformers, they call them, John Hus, John Wycliffe, and all of them who are precursors to this. So that's Europe, and in Africa. I mean, you've helped us to see what's going on in Congo. Yeah. So what are the different strands of Christianity by this time? I know we have the history. What's happening in Alexandria? What's happening in Carthage? What's happening in Nubia? What's happening in Ethiopia? And why are some stronger? Are some still vibrant in terms of their Christian expression? Yeah. Why and why not?
Yeah. So what happens? What happens in when Islam comes in around 700 into the 900s? We see a very interesting shift. So we have Christianity in a number of major areas. Let me start east. We have Christianity in Egypt, in the desert area, in the Nile Delta. and in Alexandria, which is on the, if this is a triangular, you have Alexandria at the top corner on the other side of the delta. And then you have Christianity in Libya, which is further further west. And I don't know how the screen is coming on that way, but and then you have Christianity further west in Tunisia, the tip there, up there, Tunisia, Algeria at the top there, and then further down the Nile, coming back now to Egypt, further down the Nile, you have Christianity in sort of Nubia, the Sudan area, what we call the Sudan area, and then you have Christianity in Ethiopia, and the names sort of mix into each other. In fact, they have other names at that time. You have Nobatia and some of the other names that they have for some of those areas. So essentially, something very interesting happens. Move forward to like 900, you find where Christianity was very strong in Algeria, Tunisia, it becomes very weak, almost non-existent. Now there are some small churches there, but very, very weak, and to a large measure they die out. You have Christianity in Cyrene in Libya, almost die out. Again, very little show for it. You have the Christianity in this sort of Sudan kind of Ethiopia area in the Upper Nile, again disappear. But then you have Coptic Christianity survive in Egypt and become very strong and continue to maintain links, for example, with Syria and with Ethiopia. In fact, the bishop, the archbishop or the patriarch, because in the Orthodox churches they call the Pope or the archbishop patriarch. The patriarch for Ethiopia for hundreds of years until the 1950s comes from Alexandria, and is ordained from Alexandria. And so why is it that Christianity remains in Alexandria and in Ethiopia, like modern day Ethiopia, and it dies out, say in Cyrene, in Sudan, in what is this place, in Tunisia? There are several arguments. There are several arguments, and the arguments, of course, these are generalizations, but they're helpful. The first thing, and probably most obvious thing, is that we call Egyptian Christianity Coptic. We call it the Coptic Orthodox Church. Copt is the language and is the culture as well. And so this was a Christianity that actually took a Christianity that actually took on the form of the people, and it entered into the life, into the thought process, into the intellectual engagement, into the economics, into the morality, into the law of the people. And so that happens in Alexandria, but it also happens in Ethiopia, Aksum, and in what they call Asmara, that whole. And again, this Christianity, we call it the Ethiopian Coptic or Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and so that's one thing. That first of all, it is a Christianity that is contextualized and incarnates. Jesus incarnated into those cultures. And if you go into Ethiopia today, you're going to find Ethiopian Christianity is everywhere. And Ethiopia has had Islam for as long as Islam started, really. But the Orthodox Christianity is very strong there. So it contextualized. I think a second reason that I would say is that The Christianity in Egypt and in Ethiopia, as opposed to say Christianity in Tunisia or in Cyrene, was able to maintain a vibrant connection between livelihoods and the, let me say, even politics of the places, so that in Ethiopia you find both the monarchs and the aristocrats and the person and their subjects or their peasants, or whatever you want to call them, were combined in their faith and in their understanding of Christ. And somehow even Christianity was able to enter into the legal systems. It was able to enter into, and this is somewhat different from what I would say by contextualization, because it can become, Christianity can become institutional, and that's what happened in Nubia, for example. Christianity was a court religion. It was the religion of the king and the queen and their family, and the missionaries came to them, but the guy on the ground, he continued on with their own faith. And so when something happens to the political system, when something happens to the missionaries, the whole thing collapses. And so because it entered in, then that really helped. In places like Tunisia and so on, it did not contextualize. In fact, it was a Christianity that was Latin and possibly very abstract to people who could not understand the language. And the Muslims generally tended to do a better job of integrating the trade and the politics and so on, and to do it within their own religious framework. And that didn't happen in Cyrene. It didn't happen in Tunisia and Algeria. But there's a third reason as well, and it is that Coptic Christians and Ethiopian Christians, or sometimes as they are called, Ethiopic Christians or Ge'ez speakers, because they speak that Ge'ez or Ge'ez, if you want to call it that. Those Christianities were able to articulate themselves and remain orthodox in their theology, using their own terms and their own languages. They spoke their own language. They used their own terms. They used their own metaphors. And they were able to articulate Christianity for themselves, and to stick to what we call Orthodox Christian doctrine. That cannot be said of Christianity in Tunisia or in Carthaginian Christianity, because Carthaginian Christianity was bedeviled by issues of orthodoxy. It's ironic because Saint Augustine was from the area, and he put up a very strong defense of the gospel against, for example, the Donatists, around the question of grace. What does God's grace do for the individual with regard to sin and so on? And so the fact that Ethiopian Christianity remained orthodox and was not depending on anyone to theologize for it. Nubian Christianity depended on Egyptians to defend it. And on the other side, there was just this big battle going on between Orthodox Christianity and Donatist Christianity, and that lack of strong orthodoxy, theological grounding locally, that could be articulated in their own terms to address their own issues, so those Christianities fail.
Thanks, Doc. And I think actually we are at the end, and I think I'll be, asking those who are here with us to just engage in the chat section. I'm seeing a question or two which I'll be reading shortly, and also for those who are on YouTube, I think we have a few here who can help us to read some of those. But I think you mentioned something interesting, Kyama, concerning contextualization or even translation, that for Christianity to to continue to have its power, it must be a part of our life. And you've mentioned, the importance of language, of Christianity, engaging our day-to-day life, our cultural life, our intellect, our thinking, of course, our spiritual life.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you look at what would be your comments with regards to, I know some of the early, say, African theologians in the post-colonial times, in the 1900s.
Yeah.
For example, British says, Africans are religious, but in terms, when you look at the culture, is that so? Is there a difference between maybe being religious and being biblical or being Christian? What is your take in so far as, would you say in our time, is the gospel a part of our day-to-day life as say Kenyans, maybe even not necessarily as Africans, because Africa is rather huge, as we have had. What would you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, the process of translation, translation is the term that is used by Lamin Sane, used by Brian Stanley, Mark Shaw. Contextualization, indigenization, and inculturation is used by an older set of theologians, Laurenti Magesa, people like Jean Makela.
Maybe could you define those terms maybe as you continue to explain? Sorry for barging in. Maybe for those who are not coming from a theological background.
Yeah. So translation is a bit simpler to explain. It's the entry of the gospel into the culture, the life form, the thinking, the very fiber of life of a people. Inculturation inculturation, contextualization, and indigenization are like aspects of that. And so they are used interchangeably by some people, but there are others who like to separate them. I like to separate them, where I would say inculturation is being able to speak the gospel in the language, in the idiom of the people. Contextualization is when people take that gospel and they're able to live it out within their context and apply what they're hearing, and then process it in their minds and in their hearts, and then live it out in their lives. And then indigenization is the shift from missionary leadership of the church into indigenous leadership of the church. So they're related terms. So is that happening today? In some instances, it's happening. In some places, it doesn't happen. Let me say there are spaces where there has been a concerted effort to see, translation happen, and sometimes, when the effort is much more coordinated, much more thought through, then people tend to move much further. And the Catholic Church has been thinking about this for a long time. And asking themselves questions, and they've had doctrinal battles and all those kinds of things to engaging with that, and the concepts begin very, very early with people like Dino Billy, reaching out in Asia and so on. Some Jesuit priests reaching out in Asia, in China. But then later on, we have others, Hudson and so on, trying to go and make, as Protestants, trying to go and make their presence felt. So is that happening here today? Like I said, the Catholic Church has been thinking about that for a long time, and so they have engaged into some sort of an intellectual process to get into some of that, and they have written very widely. I think the problem is with us Protestants, because the nature of Protestantism is that it's diverse and sometimes schismatic, sort of fragmentary, and so some of those challenges of being fragmented slow down our perspective on translation and rooting ourselves in. Secondly, Protestants have inherited a European trait, which is, let me say, an Enlightenment kind of thought process in terms of our theology. As Protestants, and let me say, as especially for those of us who are well, schooled and who have gone into theology school and so on, where our perspective on religion is based on a series of ideas, and so logic and ideas, and so we're not able to give room for ambiguity, and on the within that ambiguity is where Christ enters and gives clarity. For some of our traditions, especially Protestant traditions, that come from a post-Enlightenment background, we don't like that ambiguity. African culture can deal with ambiguity, but European Enlightenment thinking does not do very well, and so it's either one thing or the other, or if it is one thing, it's one thing only, and there can be no no negotiation around that. And so Christ becomes a Christ who has to fit within a certain box in that sort of thing. And so that kind of thinking actually prevents translation from taking place, because translation happens in those gray areas as Christ enters there and as discipleship enters, and it's not a one-time thing. It is a thing that happens. This generation translates the gospel into the culture changes a little bit, and then the next one gets in, and it continually does that until when you go to a place like Ethiopia, you can't separate what is Christian and what is culture. And yet they say the Nicene Creed like most Protestants. In fact, I think it is Martin Luther, the reformer, who was surprised by Deacon Michael, and he said, "These people are Christians. They say the Nicene Creed like we do, or they say the creeds like we do. They believe in creed of Christianity. They're very noble." And so yeah, I think those are some of the things that I think we need to be careful about that, and to begin to chart our own journey, to ask ourselves those questions. What does morality look like in our context? Given what God's word says that is very clear about this particular issue, what happens when the areas are a bit more gray? How does Christ step into that? And when Christ steps into that, it clarifies even more what is already clear, and then begins to incarnate, and the word begins to become flesh in John chapter 1.
Amazing. Sawa sawa, asante sana Daktari. I think we'll jump into the Q&A in the interest of time. So I'll just read, I'm seeing two here. So the first is from Bill Dindi, who asks, what explains the relative scantiness of information on the historical Nubian church? It seems as if there's more written and said about the Ethiopian Orthodox and historical Northern African church, but little to do with Nubia. What might be the explanation for this?
It's actually just what I said. They relied on the Copts to write. The missionaries came from up north in Alexandria. They are the ones who came with everything, and so I think because of that, you find what are left are the churches. Some of the churches are left there, and then the records from Alexandria, records from Syria, because there were missionaries sent from Syria to come into those into that Nubian church, Frumentius and others. And it's the same thing also with the church in Cyrene. The very vibrant Hebrew community in Cyrene, but the church there somehow got just disappeared because it relied on someone else, and there's nothing that was written in the local languages, even though some of those places were also literary cultures and they had their own script. So that's what I would say. We don't even know, we haven't even scratched the surface with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. There's so much that is hidden because they have a monastic tradition, and they have Where I work, just right behind me is an archive, and in that archive we have materials written that are 300-400 years old in Gez. And there are songs written by people, words, prayers written by these people. Their history is locked up in goatskin scrolls, and so they're still waiting to be discovered by the English-speaking world. It's same thing with Syrian Christianity and so on.
Great. I think that's helpful in terms of just understanding that history. Then Naliaka asked, what caused the tempering of the Christian fundamentalism and in the converse, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism? Would it be too apologetic to assume that it is a case of security and insecurity? Of course, I understand we still have pockets of fundamental Christians and liberal Muslims. What are your thoughts? So quite a bit.
Yeah, there are many things, and I feel that so
one by one.
The Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism are very similar. It's basically taking the tenets of what we believe and pushing them to an extreme to advance an economic, political, or social agenda, that happens today. It happens today, and it is the use, and it is even more dangerous when you have fundamentalists gain power or gain
political influence.
Yeah, political influence. Now we've seen that in the Arab world, and as Christians, we're very easy to, you can always point to those. But we're now seeing that, we've seen that in the Western world, I want to say this sensitively, but we have seen that Christian fundamentalism can have a dark side that can be very, very detrimental to a society. But these kinds of fundamentalism are fairly scattered in history. This is not like a long-term thing, and so I would say my response to Naliaka would be that the two are not different. Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism are not different, and they generally tend to be short-lived. If they have access to power, military, and so on, it can be disastrous. Lots of carnage, and they tend to effect on Christianity. In Europe, there are some people who converted into Islam because of the brutality of Christian kings, and so and the same thing is also true. People who are converting into Christianity today because of the brutality of Al Qaeda and the ISIS and those kinds of fundamentalist organizations.
Great. I think then there's still I think a question that's remaining. I'm seeing both on our Zoom. There's someone who wants a comment on still the Islamic, the whole case that has been made concerning violence in Islam. Is that something? Although you are arguing that it's basically it's a recent history, the Islamic terrorism and extremism especially. But I'm seeing a few people. Someone, for example, on YouTube is saying the Islamic book outrightly calls for the killing of those who do not submit to Allah, i.e., at Tawaba 29, and then actually, is it he or she quotes a few of those verses. So again, I guess the concern on violence, is this something still that's there?
That's a good question. We also have numerous stories of the people of God, decimating and annihilating, non-believers. We have, David praying for, the enemies of God their children to be dashed, heads to be dashed on stones. So I mean, all of these have to be taken in context, and fundamentalists will pick that piece in Islamic religion, and they'll use it. And Christians have picked, some of those kinds of passages and have used them for violence. Yet we are the ones to say, God is love, and so fundamentalism does not carry the whole counsel. And I think the underlying question is, okay, so what do we do with Islam? And because it is violent and it's likely to come and overrun Christianity. And I want us to shift from that, because that is not, when you look at history, that is not the problem with Islam. The problem with Islam, in my view, as a Christian, as a Protestant, as someone who has studied and tried to understand Islam and any other ideology, and Islam is much more of a religion. It's a set of practices. It's, as in Christianity, we talk about a relationship with Christ. The issue, and I think I'd like our listeners to understand it very clearly, the issue is not the fundamentalism, because that one, you can see it out there, you can react to it, you can run away from it, you can, like those people in China, you can have an underground faith that happened in Europe for hundreds of years before persecution ended. That is not the problem. The problem is not the enemy outside with a sword. The issue, in my view, and we've touched on it, and I think I need to say it more clearly. The issue is when faced with life's challenges or faced with contextual concerns, Christians have no answers and a Muslim comes with an answer. I'll give you two examples. One example is the economy. If Christians are not able to solve, for example, the question of economic inequalities, and answer the question, why is it, what is it that we can do as Christians to be able to get ourselves jobs and to take our children to school, to take our children to college, and to build a strong fabric of society that is able to support even the weak and the vulnerable amongst ourselves. If Islam is doing that, what will be the argument for our children who are not well discipled? I mean, it will be a no-brainer, and no one has to raise any sword or anything. They'll just walk by themselves. Secondly, if we have a Christianity that is so weak that God's power cannot speak into, for example, situations of illness, cannot speak into situations of provision, cannot speak into situations of political uncertainty. When we have a Christianity that does not call us up to a higher standard in terms of prayer, to a higher standard in terms of even fasting, someone is going to a higher standard in terms of societal injustice. When someone else comes with a different ideology, and they see all of those things, because our hearts are yearning. When we look at our world, we see brokenness. That's why creation is groaning. Romans chapter 8. When that creation is groaning, and we are not able to articulate a Jesus who can speak into these things, people will wander off and go into every other ideology. And I think for me, that is what we must be most concerned about. Is Jesus speaking into our situations? Now, the Pentecostals, like them or hate them, have tried to address the issues of Christ's power for illness, Christ's power over provision, Christ's power over uncertainty through prophecy, to try and create some clarity. Granted, there have been a lot of abuse, but they're tapping onto something, because that is first century Christianity. And we need to begin to ask ourselves, why is it that part of Christianity is growing so fast in Africa, regardless of all those other things that are going on? I think they're beginning to answer that question. And I think for us as Christians, that's where we must go back and begin to say, what is Jesus saying into our context? And that, I think, is what the real problem with Islam is. In Europe, we're already seeing it before our very eyes in our generation, where their ideas and their ideologies have failed, and they pushed back Christianity to the back burner. They brought in secularism, materialism, and so on. And then you begin to find that slowly by slowly, the younger generation of Europeans is beginning to shift. And even the population dynamics are beginning to shift, so that you find a place like France, which 15 years ago, 20 years ago was the most secular, now is the most Muslim in Europe. Several hundreds of years ago, France produced a line of popes for 100 years from Leon. So I think those are the questions, fundamental questions that we must ask ourselves. How does Christ speak into our context and into our world today, and how can we make sure that Jesus is answering the questions? There's it says, Christ is the answer, but he needs to be the answer for questions that we are asking, not for questions someone else is asking.
Right, and I guess so. I hear your point, Dr. Kyama. I think it's critical that then that Christianity transforms our entire life. I think that's granted, and I think you're saying it seems as if Islam is answering that question, especially for particular people. In fact, the other day I was speaking with someone, and they're saying even during this COVID time, I think in the block of apartments where they stay, there are some Muslims who have approached people there and offered to loan them some money, to start businesses or such initiatives. But the only thing, of course, they need to do is to attend the prayers on Friday, right?
Yeah.
So granted, but I think it seems as if there's still some more pushback, because people are saying, so there is the argument of where Islam as an ideology is accepted without any violence, and I think there would be cause for that. I know of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people who have I don't know if it's called, maybe not converted to the faith, but embraced Islam for different reasons. But then someone is still saying that they'd love to hear on Islam and violence a little bit more. Don't we see violence ingrained in Islam with public flogging, killings, etc.? Its centrifugal violent thrust has also been demonstrated, with its spread really being at the hilt of the sword. Concepts like jihad, this person is asking, compulsory taxation on non-Muslims, anti-conversion laws, etc. We continue to see this even in the Gulf Delta or Emirate states that you cite. Fundamentalist Islamism, like the Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, is the ideological basis for many radicals and terrorist groups. What do you would you argue? Would you argue still the point he's making is that this is still something among the radical Islamic, the radical Islam, which is still a very small minority of general Islam? Or how would you respond?
Yeah. The fact that you see a lot of it does not mean that it is normative, and much less to say it is not normative in history. And the very same things that you change, if exactly the question that you've read, you can shift those, you can actually say that exactly of Christians. And the word that we normally use, the word we use today of crusades, the background of crusades, for our listeners, is a time when Christians declared a jihad over Jerusalem, and essentially people would be forced to believe under the threat of the sword, and that it was better to dispatch you off to hell if you refused to convert. Much of Europe, when Europe was being formed in the 800s into the 900s, people were converted under the threat of the sword. Charles the Great, Charlemagne, that was his legacy as he was trying to create Europe as we know Europe today. And so in the times of the Crusades, there are people whose Islam was strengthened by seeing the violence of Christianity. And so I think it's important to understand that first of all, those forcible conversions, whether they are Christians or Muslims, are very they're very ineffective, because the whatever faith is produced after that there has no longevity. There's no discipleship. You became a Christian because you didn't want to die. And so at that point, there's no discipleship, there's no theology, there's no doctrine, there's nothing. And so any wind that comes after that can very easily take it away. And so again, it's important for us to understand in the scope of, we're looking at a history of 2,000 years here. When you look at the pockets of fundamentalist, violent, religious action, they're very small, and they are not very effective. And so that is why our focus must be more on apologetics. How is our Christian faith answering the questions of the day? On discipleship, authentic local discipleship. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that you find with children these days is that Muslim children will go for madrasa no matter what, whether it's raining, whether it's or what have you. Middle class Christian children will be watching TV. They'll be playing video games, and they'll be enjoying life. And doing those things that their parents say, well, I never did this, so I'm going to make sure my children do this. And you find that in their formative years, they are not able to link their identity with their faith. And that is a key fundamental thing. How do you link your identity with your faith? And that is what we should be concerned about. We should be concerned when someone comes and gives you a loan for business and says COVID is tough, but my faith tells me that I need to reach out to you so that you can also thrive, and we can also thrive, and we can go and pray to God together. That's something that one needs to be, let me say, careful about. And we have the answers, and our answers are not in religion. Our answers are in a relationship. With Christ, and I think that's that I think needs to be the big. And I think we also need to understand that the enemy that is outside there that you can see, and that is hurling stones at you, that enemy you can deal with. One of the things I like to say is, don't be concerned about Islam because they're building many mosques. Because the leap to come from your house or from where you're walking to enter into the mosque, that's a very huge leap. What you need to be about is that when you switch on your TV and your children consume secularism from inside your house, from your phone, you're giving your kids a game to play, and the game has got certain values. Those kinds of things. And here's another thing: we take our children to school. One person's child goes to madrasa, they link their identity with their faith. Your child is at home, I don't know, playing this or watching Frozen. Frozen has its own values that it is pushing. It's pushing gender fluidity and all of that stuff. But the other kid doesn't have time for that, and so your child grows up with a certain kind of dysphoria between their religion and their identity, and this be so sure of their identity and their religion. And when the two come face to face, a child who has got a certain assuredness about their identity is very attractive. And so I think and we can pray and fast and cast demons, and my church tradition is for praying and binding. We can bind these things, but we must get out there and battle them, with the tools that God has given us, reasoning together, having a reason for the faith why we believe. We must be able to defend ourselves. We must begin to see our identity as inextricably tied to Christ and as the solution for the challenges that we have on a day-to-day basis. Sorry, you probably need to unmute.
I think that's a fantastic response, and that's a reminder of, I think the times we are living in are serious times that require, us to really deepen our understanding of the faith. Fortunately for the church, it isn't something that is strange to us, because especially in the early times of the church, there was an entire discipline of, what people call catechism, which is just how do we deepen the understanding of our children, especially the questions they're asking, especially in this time. And I think that's a very helpful reminder for us. Wow, I think there's so many questions, and I think in the interest of time, I'll just ask one that will kind of be segueing us towards the last session, which will be on the second Wednesday of the next month. That is the month of June, where we shall be having the last part. We'll be looking at the missionary, history. Again, a very volatile topic, because it raises very many questions for us. On the 9th of June, we shall be engaging again with Dr. Kyama for our last session, and therefore looking at more towards the contemporary time. But the question is being asked here, Dr. Kyama, it's a big question, but you can give a big answer as well. Someone is asking, what is the future of Christianity in Africa, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a big question. I have certain spiritual gifts. I don't know if prophecy is one of them. At least not that kind of prophecy. The future of the church, and Africa is a big place. There is North Africa, there is East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, Central Africa. East Africa, you have, I don't know what, depending on who's counting, you have 7 countries or you have 3 countries, depending on what, what you're going to say. The future of the church in Africa will depend on our faithfulness. It's going to depend on our faithfulness and commitment to the person, the work, and the teachings of Jesus. And it's not faithfulness in sitting down and reading Os Guinness, or one of my favorites, N.T. Wright. Those are good to read. It's good for you to read all of those things, but we must come back to ourselves and say, how do we answer the key questions in Africa? How do we answer the key questions in Africa? Or rather, how does Jesus answer for us the key questions in Africa? I am particularly optimistic about forms of Christianity that have been thinking about this and have have some semblance of answers, and they're found in all traditions. You find them in amongst Anglicans, amongst Presbyterians, Catholics, Charismatics, Pentecostals, and so on. But we have a lot of work to do, especially on the Protestant side. We have a lot of work to do in terms of creating a system or a structure, like a catechetical system that will, give the coming generations a continuous cycle of discipleship and catechesis, so that we can become more rooted and we can connect our faith with our identity as Africans. So long as we keep thinking that Christianity came with the missionaries, and I think that's another. Someone talked about the enemy being a smooth operator. That's a lie of the enemy. The enemy wants to say this thing is so this thing is so bad that it needed to have come from somewhere else. Other people will say this thing is so good that Africans cannot really articulate it or cannot really understand it fully for themselves. Both of those are lies from the enemy. Jesus came that we may find life and find it in abundance, not life that looks like someone else, but life within our context, life within our language, within our culture, life within our continent, within our realities, within our inequalities, within the brokenness that we find of the kind that we find on the continent. Every continent has its own brokenness. The brokenness that we find in our continent, we must be able to listen carefully to hear Jesus speaking into those into this context, and begin to speak words of life into this, and his resurrection power, to use Paul's words in Ephesians, his resurrection power coming alive, on these particular issues. And I also want to say here again, the future of Christianity will be secured when our faith in Christ has tangible results. It is one thing to believe, part of my career is reading books and engaging with ideas and so on. But at the end of the day, even with all the ideas that I have, I think our faith, or the faith of my children, will be practical when I sit together with with my child who is ailing, and we sit and we say, what does God's word say about us? What does God's word say about where illness came from, about where disease came from? What does God's word say about where healing comes from? What does God's word say about the inequalities and the injustice that we see that makes us, drive to school, but also see other children begging on the streets? What does Jesus say to that, and how can we be a part of Christ's answer to some of those situations? So long as we are able to do that, then the future of Christianity on the continent is bright. At the point at which we are not able to do that, either we become too theoretical, or we borrow someone else's Christianity or someone else's theology or someone else's doctrine, or altogether we believe that Christianity has nothing to do with us, then the future will be very bleak. But as at this point, I am optimistic.
And I think you end on a fantastic tone, which is a tone of optimism. I think we have just been saying that the Christian faith has such a rich heritage in this continent of ours, that sometimes is a continent of paradox, for sure, but nonetheless a continent for which God has called us in whatever vocations we currently find ourselves in, whether we are in business, whether we are students, whether we are teaching, whether we are farmers, whatever we are. I think the rallying call has been that God is still inviting Africans today to look to Christ and to trust in him, for forgiveness of sins, but also for a new life that must be tangible. Again, Christ asked us and asked the disciples, how will they know who his disciples are? They will be known by their fruit. And definitely then there is a sense in which our faith must not just be the beliefs we hold, which are critical and very important, the doctrines of our faith, but Christian faith is also a very practical faith. It must touch, every square inch of our lives. So asante sana, Dr. Mugambi, for your time. 1.5 hours. These people are still asking more questions. But since we said it was not, if it was a kesha, it would have been another thing. But since it is not, I'd like to just thank you for your time and for your insights. God richly bless you as you continue to, to make your Christianity tangible in the area of academic, theological reflection. In this time, I think we need that as a continent. We need to continue to develop our theology for the African context, and for the work that ATNP is doing. Would God richly bless that work and raise up more people? I'm seeing someone else, Naliaka, is saying, thank you, Dr. Kyama, most appreciated. Looking forward to 9th June, which will be our last session. And to everyone else who has tuned in, asanteni sana, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Zoom, and you maybe watching this even later on, we sincerely thank you for the time. Apologetics Kenya is a ministry that continues to believe that we need to equip ourselves as believers, so that we not only know what we believe, but why we do that, and being able to communicate that to others. But also not just equipping believers, also engaging skeptics. And there are many of them. I think someone here was noting, just the rising secularism in many African cities, including ours, Nairobi and even Mombasa, Eldoret, and other places, that then we must be able to engage skeptics so that people are able to find the answers that can only be found in the person and the work of Jesus Christ that is sufficient for all things. Asanteni sana from myself and the entire Apologetics Kenya team, some who are represented here, we say a big thank you. Allow me to end with words of prayer. Father, we give you praise and we are grateful that you are the sovereign Lord, that Lord, you have called us to the mission that you are doing, the mission that you began many, many centuries ago. And primarily, Lord, the mission that you did through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary, and that you have invited us as African Christians and as believers in this season and in this time, in this generation, to continue to point people to Jesus Christ, who is life. We thank you and praise you for Dr. Mugambi and the work he's doing. We speak a blessing to him. We ask that, Lord, you would continue to enrich him and equip him and bless him together with his family as they serve you, Lord. As your word says, as they refresh others, would you continue to refresh them? We thank you for each and every person who has tuned in today and who will be tuning in later. We pray that, Lord, you would continue to speak to us, continue to help us to be zealous for the things of God and the things of Christ, especially as we consider the things around us, the relationships around us, the situations and issues around us. Would our faith be a faith that touches even the least of these? For the glory and honor of your name, we ask these things, believing and trusting in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen and amen. Asanteni sana. Do have a pleasant evening with your families, with your friends. Asanteni sana. God richly bless you.